agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Trey Orndorff, a political scientist at Oklahoma Christian University, and I'm joined by the professor of law at Chase Law School, Ken Katkin. Ken, welcome to the show.
Hey, Trey, it's great to be back.
It is good to be back myself, right? So I was out of it for a little bit, and that's what COVID will do for you. So it almost felt like I was catching up with you. So you had COVID, then I had COVID, and but you're better, and that seems unfair.
Well, life isn't fair.
Now, so here's now. You also do other kinds of radio shows and things, Ken, right? I mean, I wish you were just an exclusive politics guys, but we can't keep you just to us.
That's
and
true.
I was thinking about you this week, and so I'm curious about your musical knowledge. Somebody kind of who was a part of my teenagehood passed away this past week, who is musical.
As I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I take a look at my life and realize there's nothing left, because I've been blasting it.
Coolio died this week, and I didn't know if that meant, because you do a bunch of music stuff.
Yeah.
So, I mean, was Coolio ever in your rotation of things, or was that just a footnote for you?
Yeah, I'm going to be doing my music radio show tomorrow, and I'm going to be memorializing 3 or 4 musicians who passed away this week, and Coolio will not be one of them.
That's what I kind of figured. Wow, I love it. Well, so what we're going to be dealing with is not the premature death of early 90s rappers, but rather we're going to take a look at what's been happening, well, with the Nord Stream is where we're going to start. And then from there, we're going to talk about some fast-moving developments as it occurs to Russia and the annexation of about 15% of the Ukraine. From there, we're going to move forward and we're going to take a look at the ongoing overruling by Judge Cannon of the special master in favor of Trump. We're going to see what's going on there. I'm really curious, Ken, about that with the two of us. We'll also talk about McConnell's potentially surprising support of the Electoral Count Act. And then if we have time, we've got some additional stories from there. But that's where we're going to be headed. So we're just going to take a brief pause, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the Nord Stream pipeline. Okay, so Ken, this week we're going to start the show off with 2, related in some ways, stories on a larger story that the politics guys have been discussing for a long time, and that's Russia, right? This first was kind of a shock discovery this week after multiple leaks in both the Nord Stream 1 and the Nord Stream 2 were discovered. Now, these are gas pipelines that run from Russia to Europe beneath the Baltic Sea for listeners. Now, the Nord Stream 2 was never it finished it was never put into use, but it too was attacked. And the fact that we've had these multiple hits on 2 separate pipelines, everyone, and by everyone I mean all the states involved, are pointing to sabotage. But to this point, no specific culprits have yet been announced. The European Union called it sabotage, and officials there lower down have said that the culprit was, quote, very obvious, end quote, but would not go beyond saying anything like that. Here in the United States, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin said it was still too soon to name names without an investigation. He called anything else simply speculation. Now, meanwhile, Russia, including Vladimir Putin, have called it, quote, an act of international terrorism, end quote. However, the head of Russian intelligence has suggested that the West is in fact covering up the real perpetrators. So there's a lot to unpackage here, including it's not immediately obvious who benefits from this attack. So for Europe, it appears most experts and outlets are saying that this is a release of 3 days worth of gas of Germany at time. And the EU kind of wanting to destroy that seems really unlikely. Similarly, though, it's a little unusual on the Russian side because Russians damaging the pipeline in many ways probably weakens the position it has over the EU. Because if it can't control the energy, one of the kind of few remaining connections are really severed. So all we know for sure at this juncture is that large explosions underwater are the seemingly the cause of sabotage to the Nord Stream 1 and 2, and that this obviously isn't a natural phenomenon. So one, of course, Ken, is the who's to blame, but the other, of course, is whoever is to blame. What impact will this have on the violent and ongoing situation of the war between Russia and the Ukraine? So thoughts?
Well, it is perplexing, and I've got no more idea than anybody else who's to blame. I think the only one thought I have is, in some ways, the perplexing nature of the sabotage is like a continuation of the perplexing issue of even before the sabotage, who was taking sanctions against who. The Europe was being encouraged but to take sanctions and not buy Russian gas, and at the same time, Russia was saying, well, we're gonna take sanctions against Europe by not selling them Russian gas, and I that whole thing was very perplexing, and this just seems to be an extension of the same to me, and I can't figure it all out.
No, because oftentimes in these international kinds of terrorist events, terrorism by definition, we should get a little wonky here, Ken. Let's get a little wonky. Terrorism by definition, the purpose of terrorism is to scare individuals into particular kinds of policy outcomes or in particular kinds of directions. So one of the things that I can kind of say as a scholar on this front, that makes this act not so much a bit of terrorism as it seems like a different kind of state sabotage. Now, that doesn't necessarily explain who it is, but it might help rule some things out. Again, when you have terroristic acts, you're trying to scare people into particular policy outcomes, and that doesn't appear to be the case here. Or likewise, you oftentimes want to take responsibility for it. You want to say, hey, we're the ones who did this, and more is coming if you don't, if something doesn't, right? And we don't have anything like that.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to your point, if it were some form of terrorism or even some form of, actually, undercover military activity by one of the sides in the conflict, it doesn't make sense, because one thing that either side would want to do if they were trying to disrupt the flow of oil, they would want to, have some kind of carrot attached to that stick and say, either side would want to say to the other, well, if you stop, the West would be saying to Russia, if you withdraw from Ukraine, we will start buying the gas from you again. Or Russia would be saying to the West, if you just let us take Ukraine, we will start selling you the gas again. But the sabotage actually takes that option off the table, right? The pipeline's been disrupted, so it's going to stay disrupted even if the conflict ends, at least for a while.
Precisely. And the other bit that's, I mean, to think logistically about this, to kind of put on our international relations or counterterrorism hats, it's not an easy task to get this deep under the Baltic Sea, and it's definitely not that easy of a task to have the kinds of explosives it would take in those kinds of locations to make that kind of explosion. And that too is a complicating question about this. Is it a rogue element? Is it some other state? But I mean, of course, we could speculate on that forever, and that's going to be difficult. I am curious about that, and I hope that helps. But on that kind of second point that I brought up, and you were then talking about it here, what does this mean for the ongoing relations or non-relations between Europe and Russia? Because this was kind of the tentative thing that was holding everybody from just having a complete severing. This kind of changes the landscape. What do you think is the few weeks out as we move forward between the two, these two particular semi-belligerents?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what you and I were both saying before, that, one of the pressures that was on both sides to try to end this conflict was that Europe needs Russian gas and Russia needs Western money. And so, as long as the conflict was raging, that mutually beneficial exchange was disrupted. And what's happened now is that mutually beneficial exchange is going to stay disrupted for a while, even if the conflict ends. And I suppose that means there's less pressure on each side to end the conflict, right? Ending the conflict isn't going to get Europe the gas that it needs, or at least in the quantities that it needs it. It isn't going to get Russia the Western currency that it needs. because they're not going to have enough ability to deliver the gas. And so I feel like it could exacerbate the conflict and lengthen it. And maybe that's, that analysis is pointing us towards an answer, not a definitive answer, but if we think about, who could have done this, it seems like who gains might neither be Western European governments nor the Russian government, nor the American government. So maybe it was somebody else.
Yeah. One of the things that comes to mind, to put it in, again, this is, we have to put it as speculation, but, reasoned, thoughtful things you might look at. We did see, and the politics guys have talked, Mike and Jay were talking about, we saw a number of other authoritarian leaders peel away from Putin, right? Most prominently in India. But even China is not supporting him in the way that they did at their most recent meeting. And so, yeah, you're right to suggest that there are potential other state actors who might have interest in lengthening the conflict. What do you think this does for the Ukraine, though? I was kind of trying to think about it in terms of the Ukraine. It seems to me that this probably weirdly helps the Ukraine because it kind of will continue to help the EU have reason to continue to support them and not be able to just forget about it in the way that we had talked about at one point.
I think it's a wash for the Ukraine because although I agree that now there's less pressure on Western Europe to settle the crisis, perhaps on terms that would be a compromise with Russia and then thus not great for the Ukraine. I agree with your analysis on that half of it. I think the other half of it's there too, that Russia has they have less incentive now to try to settle with Western Europe. And, I think that to the extent that we were both saying before that the tendency might be to lengthen the conflict and to take away an incentive for early settlement. Lengthening of the conflict doesn't seem to me to be great for Ukraine either. It just means that their country is a battleground for longer. And Russia, even today we saw Russia kind of declaring that it's annexed certain parts of Ukraine. And, even as it may be being forced to withdraw from other parts of Ukraine, I think it may think, well, it can consolidate what it can hold and try to hold it. And I don't think that's great for Ukraine.
Well, let's actually move into that second story, because I think, as you're rightfully pointing out, these are related. And so to kind of add some meat to that, so the related second story here is the annexation of a large portion of occupied Ukraine. So what happened this past week was, in fact, Russia had the largest annexation in Europe since World War II. Russia took control over, or declares annexation over 15% of the Ukraines. And on Friday, Putin proclaimed the annexation votes that happened earlier in the week, well, sham votes, but as, quote, are becoming our patriots forever, end quote. And further, and ominously, quote, we will defend our land with all our strength and all our means, end quote. Obviously reiterating his hasty press conference a couple weeks ago over the threat of the use of nuclear weapons. Now, the annexation, as I just noted, comes after sham votes earlier this week where civilians at the point of guns were asked if they wanted to be in Russian control. At best, that was the kind of vote that happened. The call for annexation, though, also comes, Ken, with the requirement to call up more troops, military reservists. So at the same time as this annexation is going out, we're seeing this week a mass exodus of many Russians attempting to flee the draft at the same time, especially as those in rural regions are picked up to fight. Now, as Putin is speaking on Friday, and this is just speaks to the ongoing evolving nature of the situation, on the battlefield, they are suffering their worst setback yet. Russian units in the Lehman pocket have been now completely isolated and surrounded, according to military analysts, and it seems unlikely that they're going to be freed. Now, pro-Russian outlets are saying that the groups are heroically defending, quote unquote, but it seems likely that heroically defending or otherwise that this regiment is on the verge of being captured. And this is right there next to the lands being annexed by Russia, which again, we're closing in on this. What happens if and when the conflict takes place in the portions of the Ukraine that Putin has now declared are our compatriots forever, to defend by all our means. Ken, what do you think about the combination of these two things?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there. I guess as you said, I agree with you that there's several related developments. The development of the pipeline sabotage, the development of a lot of surprising Ukrainian military successes in many areas of Ukraine. Those I think are closely related to the timing and the reasoning behind why Putin decided, well, if he can't hang on to all the territory that he was hoping to hang on to in Ukraine, and if he doesn't have an incentive right now to try to settle with the West amicably, he's going to try to hold what he can. And so he's annexed, the particular regions of Ukraine in the east where the Russians have had the most influence for a relatively longer period of time, even before the full-fledged invasion started. These are areas that Russia has considered breakaway regions for some time. And in fact, there's a lot of these are the only areas of Ukraine where there's a significant component of the population that would be just as happy to be with Russia. So, so I think he's going to, try his best to hang on there. We had the pleasure of being called Satanists today. We Americans. He called the United States a force for Satanism, as
Listen,
well as.
I am well known for my connections to Satan. He and I go way back.
As well as totalitarianism, despotism, and apartheid. So he accused the U.S. and the West of fomenting all of those things in that area of Ukraine that he's claimed he's annexed. Ukraine has apparently expedited its application for membership in NATO now, and I don't think that's going to be quickly granted. Although I think it's a good PR move for Ukraine to try to say we've filed this expedited application right now and put some pressure on NATO to say something. But I think if NATO was actually going to grant that application in any quick amount of time, then the U.S. and all the other NATO countries would be committing themselves to immediately enter a hot war in this area, and I think that's not a likely outcome. But yeah, things are moving fast, and I think. The logic of it all is that Putin is pretty much having to decide right now what does he think he can keep, and trying to really cement his hold on that.
Yeah, and I think this is going to come to a head on that front relatively quickly. If you take a look at what's happening militarily, unless the call up of additional troops by Putin leads to significant changes in the course of the war, it seems unlikely that here, not in a few weeks or potentially a few months, we're going to be in a situation where the Ukrainian forces are going to be on the doorsteps of the annexed regions. And that's really where we're going to find out what Putin really means by this, and what he's willing or not willing to do, and what the Ukraine is willing or not willing to do once you get there. So what do you think about that? I see that as being the next big step, and I don't see it being that far away.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think so militarily, the Ukrainians, with a lot of help from the West, have been doing, I think, much better than I would have predicted, much better than a lot of commentators in the West would have predicted. Nonetheless, these particular regions, I think, are going to be the hardest to liberate from Russia because they border Russia. Russia doesn't have these same issues of kind of spreading their supply lines very thin, getting deeper and deeper into Ukraine. Like they can run supplies straight over the border from these regions right directly into Russia. They can amass forces, right up close there. They also do, I think, have the benefit of a more divided population in these areas. In most of Ukraine, nobody wants the Russians there, but in these particular regions of Ukraine, that's not true. It's probably most Ukrainians, even in these regions, would like to see the Russians out, but there's a substantial number of people living in these regions who are glad that the Russians are there, and that's a little bit different than the rest of Ukraine as well. So I think there's going to be a variety of reasons that I would not predict from the fact that the Ukrainians have done such an amazing job repelling the Russians throughout the country, that they're going to be able to continue that forward press so easily into these regions.
No, and I agree, but I guess that's kind of what leads me to the question then of I see that as being the next tipping point, right? Because then at that juncture, you could potentially have an end to the conflict depending on what Putin and the rest of the Ukraine is willing to live or not live with. Or you could see that fight hit that territory, and whether or not you see, as you rightfully note, I think the conflict shifts. I think at that point the conflict shifts, but it means then what does Putin do? Does he open up his arsenal, more widely as he has suggested? I'm just curious if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think the conflict shifts back to the international sanctions regime and not to the direct military conflict. I think I mean, I keep predicting this, and I've been wrong a few times, but I think that the costs of a direct military conflict are in terms of human life and humanitarian costs and disruption to the Ukrainian people are just unthinkable, like just overwhelming. And it gets more and more so if you're talking about a region where you're going to have door-to-door street fighting and things like that. Whereas I think right now, even though there have been a lot of Western sanctions on Russia since the beginning of the conflict, the West is finding ways today to really ratchet up those sanctions even more. I think today the U.S. enacted a new round of sanctions aimed at the defense and technology sectors in Russia, and also cut off even more Russian government officials and their families from global commerce. And there's more export controls. They're now being imposed on any company, institution, or people who provide political or economic support to Russia for its purported annexation. I kind of think that's where the battlefront shifts to. I think if you think about what the West is going to do, is it going to send in the U.S. Army and the British Army? I don't really think so. Is it going to be able to arm up Ukrainians on the ground so that they can go, do door-to-door street fighting and expel the Russians from urban areas right on the Russian border? That might happen, but I don't know. But what I do think is going to happen is that if there's a period of time where Russia is able to assert control there, military control, and kind of impose this annexation, that it's gonna lead to crippling sanctions that I think in the end really will make it untenable for them to maintain that status, and may finally cost Putin his position as kind of premier for life.
So one last question on this before we take a break and head on to the second half of the show, and that is to say, I have been reading some more recent work on the life and the history of Putin. And full disclosure, one of my graduate professors was Dr. Karen DeWisha. She and her husband, Adid DeWisha, were scholars at Miami University. He was a Middle Eastern expert and an incredible scholar and professor. And then Karen DeWisha, his husband and wife duo, she was an incredible scholar of Russian politics, and actually was the head of the Havinger Center at Miami University. And so she kind of tragically died before her time, unfortunately. And I was reading the most recent take on her work and bringing her work up to date on Putin, and trying to kind of get inside his head a little bit differently, kind of think about the institution and the structure. It's been a long time since I've done a lot of Russian reading. And so you had mentioned there, Ken, about Putin stepping down. And one of the things that seems likely is that's not in his institutional DNA, neither in the institutional DNA nor in his DNA. And I wonder how threatening of a universe we're in, or what might happen in a universe in which Putin thinks he is on the way out. You kind of mentioned that in potentially a positive way. How much do you think that might be an escalator, as a matter of fact, for Putin? I think, again, I'm thinking of this in terms of just having kind of reread and now read more of these things on the character of Putin and the institutional structure he has built in Russia.
So how much would I'm sorry, how much would what be an escalator?
If he begins to actually think that his time is imminent.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Because you had said like, hey, he could be maybe he'd be on his way out, and it triggered me to thinking about what I'd been thinking about. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he's going to try to hang on as long as he can. I don't know what he can do to escalate, though. I mean, I think the escalation. He's basically been militarily defeated in big sections of Ukraine, and I think that that has weakened his hold on power. It's turned some Russian public opinion against him, but there's not much he can do about that. And then I think in the parts of Ukraine that he's announced that he's annexed today, I think he may try not to let go of that, because that would be seen as a final humiliation that could end his rule. But it may be that it ends his rule anyhow. I think his behavior will be to just try to hold on to every possible thing that he can. But I don't know that he's going to be successful in doing that. I guess that's how I would think about that. I don't know if that fully answers your question or not.
I have one last piece to that, because I need to be more explicit. I have been reconsidering the possibility that he would use a tactical nuclear weapon in a localized way if he felt that threatened. What do you think about that?
Well, I don't know about that, because the geography here is a little bit close, right? I mean, dropping a tactical nuclear weapon, 10, 20 miles from his own national border, is gonna, I feel like that'd be tough even for him to do. It's gonna have a lot of domestic repercussions in Russia, and really, I don't know. I mean, I don't know what he would gain. I mean, he'd kill a hell of a lot of people in those states which he's claiming are part of Russia. There'd be there'd be deaths in Russia as well. And then if he managed to hold that territory because of it, what would he be holding? He'd be holding a territory that he's just turned into a lifeless desert. I don't know. I hope he's not going to do that. I'd have to think through that a lot harder. Nobody's dropped any nuclear weapons anywhere on Earth since the U.S. did at the end of World War II, and I think even Putin might not want to break that taboo.
Well, on that very uplifting thought, why don't we take a brief pause, and we'll come back and we'll move into the domestic side of politics here on the Politics Guys. Okay, so Ken, the last time we were on the show, we had the opportunity to talk about that special master request from Trump's legal team over all of the documents that had been pulled out of his Mar-a-Lago residence. And I mean, to kind of sum you up, and again, if I don't get this right, just let me know. Your basic answer was you couldn't figure out how in the world a special master would even make sense given what was happening in the case. And that made a lot of sense. And then yet, for good or for ill, the district court Judge Cannon agreed to a special master, and Raymond Dearie was chosen. Now, however, despite getting the special master, which was in fact the Trump team's request, Dearie has not exactly made Team Trump's life particularly easy. As a matter of fact, there were two specific items that were not particularly favorable to Trump. One, Dearie had told Trump's legal team that it couldn't suggest that the FBI's description or seizure of the documents was inaccurate without providing evidence, and gave them until October 7th, and gave them until October 7th to explain any inaccuracies with the government's inventory. Now, likewise, it gave them a pretty quick timeline, the end of October, to have to deal with going through the documents. Now, this week, though, Judge Cannon overruled that and stated, quote, "There shall be no separate requirement on plaintiff at this stage prior to the review of any seized materials to lodge any ex ante final objections to the accuracy of the defendant's inventory, its descriptions, or its content," end quote. So, Ken, I am genuinely curious about this, because what you had talked about made a lot of sense and meshed with the things that I knew legally. Of course, I'm not a legal expert, but I'm kind of adjacent to it. So I think a lot of individuals were surprised. And now to have the judge be kind of overruling on these matters, this doesn't seem normal, but again, this isn't my area. So walk us through this, because I have questions, but I want to hear you walking us through it first.
Yeah, well, so also we should talk about the decision of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit as well.
Yes, I want to get to that as well.
into-
If you think it fits here, please just add that in, and if that goes together in a way that I'm not seeing, please take away.
So the as we talked about last time, this case arose after the FBI executed a search warrant at Mar-a-Lago. And then Donald Trump brought a civil lawsuit after that search happened, arguing that I guess some of the documents should be returned to him, and that was the essence of his civil lawsuit. And so in that civil lawsuit, he made some substantive arguments and some procedural requests. And so his substantive arguments were that some of the documents taken either were not government documents at all, in which case they should be returned, or some of them that were government documents were subject to either executive privilege or attorney-client privilege and should thus be returned to him, even if they were government documents. And his procedural argument was that there should be a special master appointed to look into his claims about which documents should be returned to him, and make a recommendation to the trial court, and that he shouldn't be criminally investigated at all until after the special master had completed that work. So that was what he asked for in his civil suit. And Judge Cannon, I would say somewhat corrupt judge, who he appointed after he'd already lost the election during the lame duck session at the very end of 2020. While he was plotting the coup, he appointed her. Not a single Democratic senator voted to confirm her, but he squeezed her through, and she has repaid that favor by giving him everything he asked for in his order. Now, as we talked about last time, certain things that he asked for were just so legally illegitimate that I think Judge Cannon's decision to grant some of those things can only be called corrupt because there was no legal basis for it at all. But she did it. The 11th Circuit, including a 3-judge panel in which 2 of the appeals judges also were Trump appointees, essentially did accuse her of corruption and incompetence. The formal legal term for that is abuse of discretion. So they won't use such inflammatory language as corruption and incompetence, but they did use the legalism for that, which is abuse of discretion, and did say that her decision, by and large, was outrageous and indefensible. And they substantially reversed it. In particular, they significantly reversed all the parts of it that tried to enjoin the Justice Department from continuing to do the criminal investigation while this document dispute is being sorted out. And they said that the criminal investigation can proceed full speed ahead, and that includes the Justice Department's review of the documents that they already seized. And that although they did allow the special master to go forward, they certainly are allowing Justice Department criminal investigators to look at every single document, including the ones that Trump claims privilege over. And so really all that's at stake anymore in the special master's investigation would be whether, if the special master somehow finds that some of these documents are privileged, whether that would mean that the Justice Department would have to return them and would not be able to rely on them if criminal charges are brought.
Now, can I pause? I don't want to pause you too much, but sometimes I know you kind of get down holes, and I understand you. But so one thing what we're saying here is the special master is only going to be related to the civil side of this case, not the way that Cannon had originally ruled. And that's an important distinction. But now the second part...
No, actually, I want to stop. There is only a civil side of this case. No criminal charges have been brought against Trump, so the only case is a civil case.
Exactly, but they can't... They could bring something in a way
could, yeah, right.
Cannon suggested they could not.
Right, that's right. Cannon, in her first opinion, said the Justice Department can't even look at any of these documents,
exactly,
and therefore can't continue to investigate whether to bring charges until after the special master completes his work. And if the special master wants to return any of these documents to Trump, that'll happen first. And then the Justice Department, after all that's done, can look at what's left. The 11th Circuit absolutely just reversed that and said it was an abuse of discretion for her to even order that.
Right. Now, but then the second part of what you were saying there that has my head kind of turning it as I think about is, so you have the special master, because Trump's initial claims that are now just on the civil side, as you noted, we have attorney-client privilege and we basically have executive privilege.
Yeah.
But at this juncture, it's not even clear that he can have that kind of executive privilege, even though the special master is supposed to rule on it. And you were just now starting to talk about that. Talk into that a little bit, because what would happen if the special master would say, well, this has executive privilege? Because that's not how that process works, right?
Yeah, the special master is not going to say that. He's clearly going to follow the law. And, under the law as it exists today, it would not be possible for a private citizen to claim executive privilege over government documents. Now, Judge Cannon, in her first decision, the one that was overruled, when she opened up the idea that there could be executive privilege, she did cite a concurring opinion that Justice Kavanaugh wrote in the Trump versus Mazars case about his tax records, where Kavanaugh mused, speaking only for himself and not for the court, that it might be possible for a former president to still claim executive privilege over certain documents. And I think, even though only one justice ever said that in dicta, that's certainly, I think, what Judge Cannon is going to rely on. But I don't know how that could even be coherent, because in this case, even if you could hypothesize that these documents have executive privilege, there's no here. It's being asserted against the executive branch, and that's a simply incoherent concept of executive privilege. Executive privilege, to the extent that it's been recognized in Supreme Court case law, it's a separation of powers doctrine that allows the executive branch to keep some documents privileged from the legislative branch. But there's no concept of how it could be used against the president and against the executive branch, which is how Trump's trying to use it here. So, I think at most, if a document like this was actually found to be subject to executive privilege, that would just mean that it couldn't be shared with Congress, perhaps that it couldn't be shared with a court. But it should still be able to be shared with the executive branch, as all documents that are executive privileged can be shared with the executive branch.
Okay, so you were getting exactly what I was asking about, right? Because an executive branch, like if you say that, what you're saying is you can't share it outside of the institution of the presidency.
Yeah.
But of course, the other side of this civil suit is the institution of the presidency, right? Just to put this in perspective for everybody. And the defendant is saying, you can't have that institution of the presidency because I, the institution of the presidency, say that I only get to have it.
Yeah, and just to put a finer point on what you just said, it's an actual fact in this case that the president of the United States, President Biden, who is the president of the United States, signed an executive order that said, I delegate to the National Archives in this matter the right to decide whether executive privilege will be asserted or not with respect to these documents. And so that was formally delegated by the sitting president, and the head of the National Archives, exercising that delegated authority, has said these documents are not, there's no executive branch claim of executive privilege here. So we were only talking about documents where executive privilege has already been formally waived by the relevant executive branch official who's been given express authority to do that in a signed order from the president of the United States.
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes when individuals like follow the story and the way that these narratives, because we always want to have, and this holds true for a lot of media problems, we always want to think of these as kind of having, well, this side said this or this side said that, and then this side has the claim or that side, even sometimes when there aren't equality of claims always, right? It's kind of like the issue of climate change, right? Like, there's not the, well, and the voices on the other side. Well, I mean, you could have a voice on the other side, but it doesn't give it the same equal weight, right?
Yeah.
And that's a fundamental flaw in reporting. I mean, and that's something we could do a show on, as a matter of fact. Why does media? That's something Mike and I are both interested in. But I'm glad you bring that up and kind of highlight that, because I think some of that absurdity gets lost.
Yeah.
When you just kind of read, NPR's most recent take on it, or when you take a look at CBS's most recent newscast on it, or whatever.
Yeah, and I think Judge Deary, who's the special master, has pretty much already said he's not really open to these executive privilege claims, but he is open to attorney-client privilege claims, as he should be, because it is possible that there's some documents in there that are subject to the attorney-client privilege. I think a more normal proceeding for dealing with that would have just been for Trump to tell Judge Cannon what documents he thought those were and let her make rulings on that. But whether it's Judge Cannon or whether she delegates that to the special master, somebody does have to rule on whether any of these documents are subject to attorney-client privilege. But what the special master, Judge Deary, keeps saying to Trump is, tell me which documents you think are subject to attorney-client privilege so I can make a ruling. And Trump keeps saying, well, I don't know. I can't remember what documents they took. So how can I tell you that? So he's sort of saying, I need to see all the documents before I can even give you a list of which ones I think are subject to attorney-client privilege. And it's gonna take me months to look through all the documents. So I can't give you that list until after the election. And Judge Deary found that ridiculous. But that's the order that Judge Cannon just overruled. So that's the one that you wanted to talk about primarily.
So let's have one last question about that, and that is, what do you think the likelihood? Again, you just talked about the circuit court's overruling of Cannon. Do you think that that there's going to be an appeal, and do you think that the circuit court will again overrule Cannon on this issue of the delay?
I don't know if they'll bother to appeal again, because, there's kind of diminishing returns on it. I tend to think that Garland, who's a pretty by the book guy, was never really planning to indict Trump before the election. So, on the one hand, you could say, it really looks like Judge Cannon is just doing everything she can to drag this out until after the election, just to give a political favor to the Republicans. But on the other hand, I think even if she wasn't doing that, Garland was not going to bring down indictments right before the election. So I think, really by introducing an extra month or two of delay, that may not be worth bothering to bring an appeal on. I also think, Judge Deary will move very expeditiously. So even though Judge Cannon now says, Trump's got till after the election to look at the documents and claim which ones he wants to assert privilege on, that basically he's not going to every single document that he's going to end up putting on that list is either going to be one where the Justice Department already agreed. I mean, they've already agreed that some of these documents are privileged and they're willing to return them. And I'm sure some of those kind of documents will be on the list, or else it's going to be ones where the Judge Deary is going to rule with the Justice Department and say, nope, that one's not privileged either. And so all she's done is built in 2 months of delay at a time where I think, she may think I'm pushing the indictment back till after the election, but I don't think the indictment was coming before the election. And so I think Garland may just let this one sit and just live with it.
Okay. Well, let's move forward a little bit, because we got 2 more stories we're hoping to get to at least. And the next one is also a big one. It's also on the American side. We're going to move from presidency and the courts. Let's move over to Congress and talk a little bit about this past Tuesday, because this past Tuesday, Senate Minority Leader McConnell said that he supports the Senate's Electoral Count Reform Act, which modifies the 1887 Electoral Count Act. The legislation, which is led by Senators Collins and Manchin, specifically clarifies the vice president's role in an election as solely ministerial, and further raises the threshold from ejecting to a specific state's electoral college results from 1 member to 1/5 of each body, i.e. 1/5 of the House and 1/5 of the Senate. The House has already passed a more stringent version of the bill, 229 to 203, on Wednesday. Now, the 2 bills, as I'm noting, are different, especially in terms to how many it takes to object, with the number being raised from 1/5 to 1/3 of the chamber in the House version of the bill. McConnell has already called that House bill, quote, a non-starter, end quote, presumably because he sees that threshold as too high. But the fact that he backs the Senate's version means that it seems that there is likely a possibility to have a bill passed. And of course, this is in response to the actions surrounding January 6th and the idea that there was a legal argument that the vice president could do more than just recount the votes, that he could actually become part of that process. So, Ken, what do you think about the bill itself, and what do you think about its chances now that it's got McConnell on board?
Well, I think the House bill was better, but I think McConnell's Senate bill is the one that's going to pass. I think that the House is just going to have to acquiesce to it, and that's fine. It's good enough, and it will be certainly an improvement over the status quo. And I think McConnell was sort of in a position where I think he had to not agree with the House bill because he doesn't want to be accused of being pushed around by the Democrats or whatever. But I think he also realized they have to do something because, among other things, if they don't pass any of these bills, then their position would be that no matter how the voters vote in the 2024 election, Kamala Harris can just say that Biden got reelected, right? And I think that actually was the position of the majority of House Republicans and about 7 Senate Republicans in 2020. The position that the election doesn't count; it's just the vice president that gets to dictate. And so, if no bill is passed, I think that's a little bit dangerous for Republicans, and they should pass this bill. So, I think they'll pass it, and it'll be a future day where maybe they'll go a little bit farther. That would be my thought on that.
So do you like is the part that you think is better in the House that there's a higher threshold, or was there another piece to that was more what you liked in the House bill?
Well, the House bill had judicial review provisions in it that the Senate bill isn't going to have. So, if there were attempts in the various states for the relevant state officials to possibly try to certify somebody who didn't actually get the most votes as the winner, the House bill had trips to court, right then, before you get up to the level of the Electoral College, and I think that was better. The Senate bill, I think, does not have that, but what the Senate bill does have is a high enough threshold for objections, and also a very clear statement that the vice president's role is only ceremonial, and that the vice president does not have any independent judgment about whether to accept or not accept a particular slate. Either of those would have been good enough in 2020 to thwart the coup plot.
And the kind of the sham legal reasoning behind it.
Yeah. Now, I mean, I think in the House they're going to often be able to get 20% votes to object, but in the Senate, I think that's less likely. So I think this really does significantly raise the threshold for what kind of sham objections could be people could pretend to take seriously.
Okay, so we're starting to run low on time, so we'll hit one kind of last small issue. This is something actually I've been covering in my class, taking a look at the ages of presidents over time, and obviously our 2 most recent presidents have also been our oldest. Biden is 79 years old. If he opts to run again, he's going to be in his 80s. And this past week, we had a moment where I don't think anybody would have thought much about it if it was any other 79 going on 80-year-old. The Joe Biden, the self-proclaimed gaffe machine, asked where a deceased member of Congress was, specifically Jackie Walorski, at remarks for a White House conference on hunger. Now, as NPR has reported, before making those comments, there had already been a tribute to the Congresswoman paid and a video tribute paid. There was all these tributes to her as being deceased, and it's sad that she's deceased. And now he walks up and asks, "Where's Jackie?" Now, instead of just saying, "Whoops," there's some kind of mistake was being made there, the White House continues to kind of double down that there was no mistake. It was just normalness. And that seems weird. And I guess here's my question, Ken. It's not surprising that the 79-year-old guy is going to, fall asleep sitting there while the thing's on. But I guess this raises this larger question of what is, we oftentimes wonder, well, what's too young to be president? Now maybe we're kind of wondering what's too old to be president. What does this kind of say about Joe Biden term 2? I'm not as interested in I'm not surprised. 79. But I do think it opens up a question about, I don't think many people thought we'd have 80, 81-year-olds being president of the United States. What do you think about that?
Well, yeah, ideally we'd have a president who is a lot younger. On the other hand, I don't draw that much about this. Biden has been making gaffes like this his whole entire career. I think with him, this is not something that's necessarily demonstrating the onset of old age. I think I went to see him, here in Cincinnati, probably even before he was vice president. He came here for a AFL-CIO picnic on Labor Day around 2002 or 2003. And so he was, 20 years younger then. And I saw him ask somebody to stand up who was, in a wheelchair, and I think this is the kind of thing that he's capable of, So, and also I would say, I would never, I'm sure that the day that Congresswoman Walorski was killed in a car crash, I probably read that in the news also. But if you would have said to me 2 or 3 days ago, who's Congressman Walorski, I would have not remembered that she was a dead congresswoman from Indiana. So I think it's not necessarily just purely old age that explains why he didn't know who this person was or that she was dead.
Well, I was suggesting that was, they had, and that's what NPR was reporting, they had just had a tribute to her that he had watched and then had a video of her, in memoriam of her that he had just watched right before he stands up and makes his comments and then the Jackie thing. That's why I was kind of attributing that. You can remember something a few weeks ago. No, but if I'm sitting here and my student tells me, hey, my mom just died, and then I'm like, hey, by the way, where's your mom?
Again, I'm not going to say that can't be because of his age, but it could also be that he actually had other things he was paying attention to. And, if he was sitting there, he may have had an earpiece in and people may have been talking to him and he may have been listening to something else rather than listening to the presentation. Again, I can't rule out that this is a sign of old age, but I don't think that's I don't think that's the only explanation for it, and I guess in the end, one point you're making, which I absolutely agree with, and I can't disagree with at all, is, a guy at his age is going to have a little cognitive loss compared to when he was younger, is not going to have the kind of memory or the kind of retention or the ability to work the kind of hours. I'm sure he's not working the kind of hours that Barack Obama worked, but then again, I don't think Donald Trump or George W. Bush did either. And ultimately, he's got an administration. And for better or worse, a president's ability to be effective is at least as much dependent on, their administration as on their own personal cognitive abilities.
So I guess I'll come out and then ask, I think, the big question that is going to start being important as we get through the midterms then, Ken, and we can kind of end the show on this. And that is, do you think it's time that Biden just says, look, I'm going to be a one-term president and starts moving towards helping another Democrat be the next nominee?
No, I think that would be a big mistake. In fact, I think, if he really doesn't think he can serve 4 more years, I still think he should run again and get reelected and then, possibly resign after that. Because I think he's really the logic of why he was the nominee in 2020 still holds, I think. He was the one person that could have some appeal with all the different wings of the Democratic Party, which is a diverse coalition that's hard to hold together. And I don't think someone more progressive than him, and I don't think someone more centrist than him could do it. And I think he's got the relations with all the wings of the party that make it possible for him to hold it together. And I think he's got a good record to run on. And even though his public approval ratings have not always been that great, I think when it comes time to actually campaign, he'll be able to get those up. So I think he needs to run for reelection, both so that he doesn't start losing power now, and because I think he's got the best chance of anyone to get reelected. But I think he maybe does need to think a little bit about who's going to be his running mate in 2024.
I'm actually going to have to disagree a little bit, but we'll have a lot of time to debate on that. I think that he ends up handing it to Republicans if he runs again for a variety of reasons, and I do think, pragmatically speaking, that in the same way, it's important not to age people out before they ought to be aged out. But I do think there comes a point where you had said, like, even if you didn't think you could do it, I think it is inappropriate to run for an office that you don't think you could live or actually maintain. I think that would be a moral failing of an individual. So if you didn't think that was going to be the case, but if you said to me,
no,
hey,
it's been done many times. Woodrow Wilson did it, Ronald Reagan did it. I would say Donald Trump did it. I think it's been done many times.
Well, Wilson for sure, and I think that was a mistake. I mean, his wife, effectively, and his doctor running the country is an example of how much a mistake that was.
No, it's better. It was a better outcome than if the Republicans had been running the country.
See, but when you start at that point, now you start getting into almost kind of conspiratorial land, right? Where you say like if dead people are better than other individuals, come on, I think you're better than that, Ken.
That's what I think. I think it's more important that the Dems win the election than exactly whether Biden's going to be on top of his game. And so I think that he's on top of his game enough that he knows what his policies are, he knows what his principles are, he knows who he wants in his administration. And, whether he's on top of his game on a day-to-day basis to be, fully in command of all the details of governing, I think that's less important. And I think a lot of conservatives would think that Reagan did a great job as president. And, Reagan had a lot of the same incapacities and disabilities that you're ascribing to Biden right now.
Well, I guess we'll have to close the show on the irony that we have Democrats now wanting to vote for dead people. I'm just teasing anyway. The old saying is, the dead people vote. But anyway,
yep.
That's it for this week's show. If you're already a supporter of the Politics Guys, we hope you'll consider becoming one. With our supporters, we couldn't keep this podcast going. As a matter of fact, if I didn't love doing this, I wouldn't be doing it with rebound COVID, folks. And I hope you'll want to become a supporter with us and get all sorts of good stuff, including the ad-free version of this show, as well as our supporters exclusive midweek show. Matter of fact, this midweek, we're going to have a bunch of cool things going on. Ken and I are going to be starting our take on the Constitution. It was supposed to start before, but we're going to start it this week. That's going to be a lot of fun. You'll get that by being a supporter. But not only that, we have an interview that I have done that's going to be coming out. That's going to be a lot of fun. We're breaking away from the news cycles. This is areas where Ken and I are experts. I'm really excited to be doing this Constitution series with him, and I would love for you to join along. And the way you're going to join along is by becoming a supporter, and we're going to be getting this week. So you want to join us on that conversation about the Constitution over the next few weeks? Well, that's easy to do. You can become a supporter by heading to patreon.com/politicsguys. So if you'd like to support us on Venmo, we're at Politics Guys, and you can also support the show through PayPal. Additionally, all of our support links are in the show notes, as well as on our website at politicsguys.com/support. And when you're there, you're going to see all the other things, not just the midweek show, things like the Discord group. I'm going to be getting back into that this week after taking a couple weeks off from my sickness, so I'm excited to be back with you all there as well. If you'd like to get that midweek show, but you're not in a position to support us financially, we get that. Trust me, I get that. I've got 3 kiddos. Just email Mike at politicsguys.com, and he will get you all set up. Now, whether you're a supporter or not, though, I really would appreciate it if you would subscribe, rate, and review us on whatever podcast app. Maybe that's Apple Music. Maybe that's on Spotify. Maybe that's on, I don't know, maybe Pandora. People, do you all still listen to Pandora? I don't even know. Maybe it's Pandora, but we would really appreciate that. You can also always share those episodes on social media. If you've got a question, a comment, a correction, a gripe, Mike always asks for a manifesto, but I'm doing enough student grading. I don't need any manifestos. Smaller, shorter things for me, please. I'm just teasing. Anything you want to send to a share, you can reach us at mail@politicsguys.com. We're also on Facebook and Twitter, and you will find links to all of this in the handy dandy show notes. The executive producers of the Politics Guys are Bruce Johnson, Wilma Marino, Andra Masker, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, and Don Oglesby. We'll be back with a new episode next week. I hope you'll join us then.